Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions Chapter 1 webinar. We have a co-host on today, and Sierra shall be posting where you can find copies of the webinar, as well as other webinars we offer. We archive them on our website. Sarah will be posting that information soon, and she has posted something if you're interested at the end of scheduling a meeting with somebody to talk more about what we offer. All right, so let's get into the, before we start, I'm sorry. Yeah, we will have a question and answer session afterwards. But if you want to, type your questions into the question and answer box or the chat box, that's fine, so you don't forget them as we go along, but we won't get to them until at the end. All right, so let's get started. This is chapter 1, the introduction, and our kind of general template or understanding of the dissertation is kind of based on a fairly typical 5-chapter model, where the chapter 1 is the introduction, chapter 2 is the literature review, chapter 3 is the methodology, where you discuss your methodology and the processes. Chapter 4 is a presentation of your results, and chapter 5 is the discussion. Sometimes schools deviate from that a little bit, but usually all those features and all those things are still there. Sometimes they'll split chapters in 2. But this is a fairly standard structure. And you're going to hear me say this several times throughout the presentation, but always get a hold of your school's template for the dissertation or dissertation guide, if they have one. They usually do, because that will be what your reviewers look at when they're looking at your draft to make sure that you've covered everything. It'll also be your guide, right? So you have some kind of idea about what goes into these chapters. Okay, so the chapter 1, and again, ours follows a pretty standard general template. Our features that we're going to cover today, which include these sections of the chapter, are fairly typical. Very typical general guide. Again, get your school's template because they may have some slight deviations, but this again is a good general foundation. All right, those are the sections. I don't need to read those to you, but we'll be covering each one of those as we go along. Okay. So the introduction, just to pull back for a minute and give you a bigger view of what the chapter 1 is and its purpose. I think it's best to think of the chapter 1 as kind of like a blueprint, right? It's like the blueprint for your study. It answers some of the 3 big questions and discusses details about the 3 big questions, which is the what, why, and the how, right? So the what, the introduction is going to introduce your topic. That is the what you're studying. It's going to introduce and talk about the why, right? Why are you studying what you're studying? And then the how, that's the methods, right? How are you going to actually study it? And you're going to get a lot deeper into the how in the methods chapter in chapter 3, but usually in chapter 1, there is some discussion, some initial discussion of the how, of the methods. Okay, so that's what the chapter 1 does. It kind of lays those things out, right? The what, why, and the how, discusses those, introduces those, so the reader, understands what your study is going to be about, why you're conducting your study, and some information about how you're going to get there, how you're going to study it. All right, so the introduction, this is the introduction to the introduction chapter, the very beginning. And what you want to do in any introduction is introduce what you're going to be doing, what you're going to be studying, and talk a little bit about it, the topic of your study. So studies usually proceed from some kind of a problem, right? In other words, there needs to be a reason to study something, right? So usually there's an organizational issue or organizational problem or some kind of social issue or social problem. Studies proceed from things like attrition rates, maybe it's student attrition or maybe teacher attrition, or loss of a certain kind of employee in a certain sector. It could be in education, it could be low grades or low test scores, or teachers just aren't connecting with students on some issue that students are suffering in an area because of there's a lack of training for teachers, or whatever your issue is. Usually want to start off with that, right? Just start off with what the issue is that's driving the need for your study. You may want to start off with a statistic, or you can start off with a statement too, but it should be anchored in the research, right? It should be sourced. And if you use a statistic, which I think is good, if it's low grades in a certain area in a certain region or whatever, give the statistics for those grades, right? Don't just say it, you're gonna have to show it. So anything like that you can, back up your point about the problem or the severity of the problem is good. Any kind of source you use for that at the beginning, make sure it's current, right? Because if you're going to talk about, here's this issue that we need research on to understand better so we can, address it. If you use a source or statistics from 15 years ago, we don't know if that is still an issue, right? The statistics show that was an issue 15 years ago, but it may not be now. So whatever you use here, make sure it's recent. You also want to introduce, what the research problem is. So you have the organizational problem. Maybe it's low grades in a certain area or certain topic. And then what's the research problem, right? What is the kind of research that we need that's going to address this? And that's going to, why you're going to talk a little bit about why the study is needed, right? That's why your study is needed, because we need research on this issue to be able to understand it better so we can address it. So you want to introduce these things in the introduction. The introduction isn't long, right? It's just going to kind of tell the reader, introduce the issue, tell the reader what's needed as far as research and what your study is going to do. All the kind of details can be fleshed out as you go along. Okay, state what is needed to address the research problem. That would be how your study is going to kind of fill the gap, or whatever the issue is, how your study is going to contribute to that. So when you get to the end of the section, and again, this is about a page, maybe a little less than a page. Your reader should understand what you're studying and why, right? And if you want, you can end with a preview of the sections of the chapter. This chapter will include, and this list of sections. Okay, that's the introduction. The background. This is where, now that you've introduced what you're going to do, why you're going to do it, you got to catch the reader up, right? Because the reader doesn't know the topic like you do. And so that's what the background is for. Just think of it that way. If you were to describe this to somebody else, what would they need to know? Not speaking, but in a paper, right? What would they need to know to kind of get up to speed, to understand what the issue is, understand where it's been, why it's a problem, and where we are today, right? So this includes some historical material, right? You may have to go back a little ways to talk about, where the kind of issue started, where it started to become problematic, some of the research that has been, past research that's been done on the issue, kind of follow major trends. You're not getting too detail here, but you're kind of following the trends of the research, and the 70s, the research focused on these things, moving forward a little later, it focused on these other things. Here's where we are now with the research. So it's kind of a historical view. Again, just catching the reader up to where the issue has been, where we are now, and what's needed now. And also, it's not just the issue itself, it's also the research. This is important. I find people do usually a pretty good job of giving a background on the issue or the topic, but sometimes they fail to adequately give enough attention to the research that has been done on the topic. That's part of the background. Not just where the topic's been, but how have researchers been addressing this topic? What kind of research have they been conducting on the topic? What are some of the major findings along the way, right? And then so it should end with where the topic stands now, where the topic, the research stands today, and hence why your study is needed, right? Okay, we have all this information now, but we still don't have information on this one thing or in this one area, and therefore your study is needed. So kind of think of a funnel, the shape of a funnel. It funnels down to what you're going to be doing, right? Specifically, your specific topic, your specific problem, your specific angle on what you're going to be doing in relation to the topic. Okay, the research problem section is usually next. And if you think of that funnel, right, kind of moving kind of broadly from the research that's been done on the topic previously and getting more focused to what you're going to be doing, it kind of points right here to the research problem, right? This transitions from the background, and it's a more targeted, more specific overview of the recent research on your topic. To highlight what the research problem is and what you're going to be doing, right? Because the research problem basically drives the study. It's the motivator for the study, right? You can have a plan, you can have a topic, but if you don't have a research problem, you don't really have a study. I mean, it's the why, right? It's basically the why. So let's just take a step back here a minute and just let's make sure we understand what a research problem is. Because, I talk to folks and they kind of get it, they kind of don't, they're not real sure. And when they hit this section, they're kind of lost. So a research problem is like it sounds. It's a problem in the research. Okay, what does that mean? It means there's something inconclusive in the research, or there's some issue in the research, or there's something that's unresolved in the research, or there's a gap. Maybe it could be a gap. We don't know something. We still don't have knowledge in a specific area on a certain topic. All these things kind of represent research problems. It can be maybe we're looking at a topic and there's a lot of qualitative research on it. A lot of interviews, a lot of qualitative material, but we don't have much quantitative research to, say, examine the relationship among constructs. Or maybe it's the opposite. We have a lot of quantitative research on numbers and statistics, but we don't have much qualitative research that digs into the details and people's experiences with it. That would be a kind of a research problem, right? Or maybe researchers have only used certain kinds of theories to explain a topic, but there's still these other good theories that they haven't applied to it. So anything like that. And a gap in knowledge is also a type of research problem, right? That we just don't have the knowledge, in the literature on what you're going to be studying specifically. So that kind of gap in the knowledge it's a type of research problem. It's not the only kind, it's a type. So that's what a research problem is. And then your study then is designed to address the research problem. It's designed to get that information that's still needed, that represents an issue or a problem in the research. Okay. So yeah, it's a more targeted, so the section is a more targeted overview of the research problem And it specifically states the research problem and specifically states that your study is designed to address the problem. And it also includes, this is kind of the elevator kind of speech for why your study is necessary. So you want to highlight the previous research, and it's not like the background where you have a more sweeping, a more broad strokes kind of approach. This is really specific, right? Here's what so-and-so did in the past. Here's what somebody else did in the past, and somebody else. And you show what they did that's close, but you highlight what they didn't do, or you highlight the shortcomings of their studies. And then that helps you to highlight the need for your own study. All right. And with a lot of these sections, it's always good to have an example of a completed dissertation from your school, as close to your area as you can get. Because sometimes you can use your resources, you can go to webinars, and all that's fantastic. But sometimes there's just no substitute for having a good example at hand when you sit down to write, just so you can see what some of these sections look like, the actual content. But that's the idea of the research problem section. Again, that's going to drive the study. You got to have that down usually before your people will let you move forward. Sometimes they let you move forward and let you tweak the research problem later, which can be done, but it's always good to get it down. And it does require research. I mean, it does require kind of a good bit of research to get up to speed with what's been done in your area, so you can then identify something that still needs to be done that's unique. All right. The purpose, two things here. We have the purpose section and we have the purpose statement, right? And usually the purpose statement starts the purpose section. And the purpose statement is very specific. It has a certain kind of construction that you should use, right? And I have an example. I have two examples here, and I have the kind of recipe for the statement. So the first sentence in this purpose section should be the purpose statement, which should sound something like this. The purpose of this approach, design, study is to, and we can talk about verbs in a minute, examine, explore, investigate the variables or concepts, whatever you're looking at in whatever sample or setting you're using. So here's a quantitative example. The purpose of this quantitative, that's the approach, correlational, that would be the design, study, is to examine the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence in whatever your sample is, principals in, school districts in the Northeast, whatever your sample and setting happen to be. Now the verb examine, the verb's not real important, but usually quantitative studies use things like examine, verbs like examine, investigate, inquire, but examine is just a good general one. For qualitative studies, it tend to be a little more exploratory. Usually a verb like explore is usually more suitable. And let's look at that example. So it's the same kind of recipe, just different details, right? The purpose of this generic qualitative study, that's kind of the approach in the design, is to explore the challenges of African-American women as they advance to positions as university presidents in, African-American university professors in the Southwest, or wherever your sampling is and wherever your setting is. But that's the construction of the purpose statement, and it should follow that recipe. After that comes the rest of the section. It's not a long section. It may also include information about your variables, your major concepts, or the instruments that you may be using. Okay. The research questions usually come next. This is not a method seminar, so we're not going to talk about how to develop research questions, but we do We do run methods webinars and webinars on research questions. So I invite you to look for one of those if you have more interest in that. Just suffices to say that they go here. The theoretical framework usually comes next. And a couple, well, one, before we get into talking about the whole framework, theoretical framework, we need to kind of talk about two things. One is, what's the difference between a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework? And what is a theoretical or conceptual framework, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about what goes in the section. Conceptual framework or theoretical framework, what's the difference? Which one should you use? I take a real practical approach, and we do have a blog on the theoretical framework versus the conceptual framework. I don't know, Sierra, are you able to get that blog, the URL for that blog and put it in there? Sorry, I should have done it beforehand. I take a real practical approach to it, which is theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies, and conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. And the reason for this is theoretical frameworks are based on theories. Conceptual frameworks are based on concepts, right? Just like it sounds, it has the word theoretical, conceptual. Theories are used for quantitative studies because they work deductively. In other words, you're taking a general theory and you're testing it on a specific population, right? And then you're going to use that theory to kind of explain the details of what you get. Okay, that's deductively. The conceptual framework, qualitative studies work great. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah just posted the URL for that blog I'm speaking of. Conceptual frameworks usually associated with qualitative studies because qualitative studies typically are more exploratory, right? So they work inductively. So when you're conducting a qualitative study and you want to get people's insights, you want to get their details about their experiences, you don't want a theoretical overlay, right? You don't want a theory that's going to kind of inform the information that you're going to get, right? So what you want to do is get the information and then draw conclusions from the details, which is the reverse from what I said before with the theoretical framework and the quantitative studies. You don't use a theory to kind of, overlay over your findings. What you do is you take your findings and you make conclusions based on the patterns you see and the information that you get from so that's inductive. So for a conceptual framework, you use concepts instead of theories. Now, what are they? Basically, they're theory or a couple theories or concepts put together, and it acts as a way to guide your study, and it's going to help you to explain your results when you get them and talk about them in chapter 5. And I think people tend to overthink this section, and I think it's because obviously you're not familiar with it. If you haven't done a dissertation before and you haven't worked with these terms and these ideas, you're kind of you may be a little lost. The theoretical framework, basically, an example is the best way to approach it. If we're conducting a study and a quantitative study, and we're looking at the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence, then our theoretical framework would basically consist of a theory of emotional intelligence and a theory of transformational leadership, right? Basically, you want to do is say, the theoretical framework for the study will involve so-and-so's theory of transformational leadership and so-and-so's theory of emotional intelligence. You want to define the theory, right? Whichever, take one at a time. Define the theory of emotional intelligence. Talk a little bit about what the researcher developed it for. Theories are designed to develop to explain things. So what did the researcher develop it to explain? How have other researchers used it? Define any components, right? Theories often have components. Define any of those that relate to your study. And then talk a little bit about how it relates to your study, right? How the theory relates to what you're doing, right? So if you're measuring emotional intelligence, it has certain components. You're probably going to be measuring those. Talk a little bit about how those components relate to what you're doing. And then do the same for the next theory. Like I said, if it's emotional intelligence and theoretical framework, or emotional intelligence and transformational leadership, do the same for the theory of transformational leadership, right? Because those two theories are going to basically constitute your framework. Now, having said that, and we're still in the theoretical framework, we're still in quantitative studies, you need to make sure that the instrument that you're using matches with the theory, or vice versa, the theory matches with the instrument. And by that, I mean, let's go back to emotional intelligence. There are several instruments to study to measure emotional intelligence, right? So you're going to pick the one that's most suitable for what you're doing. Then you want to choose for your theoretical framework whoever's theory is the basis for the instrument, right? So in other words, Goleman, he's a big name in popularizing emotional intelligence. He has an instrument to measure emotional intelligence. There are others. If you use Goleman's instrument, you want to use Goleman's theory, right? It makes sense. And the reason for that is, the instruments are different. So-and-so Smith's theory of emotional intelligence may have different components. It may be a little different. It may measure different things, right, than Goleman's. So, whoever instrument you use, you want to use their theory. And all instruments have a theoretical basis, right? That's where they come from. They're not developed from nothing. So make sure your instrument matches your theory. Okay, for qualitative studies and the conceptual framework, the idea is still the same. It's just that, again, you're not using kind of full-blown theories. You may just have to use, specific concepts and pull the concepts, from the literature that you're looking at, from the research that's relevant to what you're doing. Define it, and then talk a little bit about the same thing. After you define the concept, how it connects to what you're doing, how it can guide what you're doing. So it's a little different. It's just kind of the scale of it, right? It's a concept instead of theories. So if we go back to our example for qualitative, the purpose of this study is to, explore challenges of African-American women as they advance to positions as university presidents. For a conceptual framework for that, you may want to use something. Again, there may not be a theory that encompasses that. You're going to use a conceptual framework. You may want to use a framework that involves barriers or challenges to promotion or advancement, right? And maybe ones based on discrimination. Okay, so you would use those concepts instead of theories for your conceptual framework. But as far as the moves you're going to make in the section, they're similar for the conceptual framework. You do the same thing. Bring in the concept, make sure it's relevant, make sure it's supported with sources, define it, talk a little bit how it connects to what you're doing. And this is a real good section to look at approved dissertations as examples. All right, nature of the study or study design. Usually there's a section in chapter 1 where you need to talk about the rationale for the selection of the study. In other words, why did you select this design over other designs? And usually that has to do with the information you want to get. If you want to see if two constructs are related or not, that's usually a correlational study. If you want to evaluate if something's effective or if something's worked, like some kind of intervention or a program, that may be a pre-post thing where you give people questionnaires before the treatment or before the intervention, and then after. That's kind of design. So what kind of design is usually determined by what kind of study or what kind of information you want to get. So you want to also summarize the methodology, including from whom and how the data are collected and how the data will be analyzed. And again, this is a methods webinar, but we do conduct methods webinars that can get more in depth in this type of thing if you want to, the methodology. And again, in chapter 3, you're going to talk a lot more about the methodology. I mean, it's going to be very detailed in chapter 3, but in chapter 1, usually there are sections that you're going to preview it. Next section is the definition section, and this is you're defining the terms that are specialized to your study, right? And you don't need to put in methods terms in here. I see people put in things like triangulation and saturation, and you don't need methods terms. You're going to define any methods terms that are relevant to your study. You're going to define in the methods chapter and discuss. These are things like your variables, your major concepts, your constructs. If you're doing a study on emotional intelligence, well, emotional intelligence would be here, right? In the section, other than the definitions, there's a simple sentence to set up a section is all you need. The following terms are defined for use in the study, period. And then go to your definitions. They should be alphabetized, right? I say they should take the form of sentences. Check your school's template. Some schools want sentences, some schools don't care. I just put them in the form of sentences just so somebody doesn't come back and say, hey, put these in sentences. And it sounds better than fragments anyway. Definitions should be clear and succinct. Now remember, these are definitions for the terms that you're going to, specialize, that you're going to be looking at in your study. They're not discussions. I've seen definition section where people are saying, well, so-and-so defines emotional intelligence this way, but somebody else defines it this way, and yet a third person defines it this way. No, these are not discussions, right? These are how this term is going to be defined in your study. So they're short. I mean, a sentence, maybe 2 sentences, unless there's any, good reason to go beyond that. They should be, a good clear sentence, maybe 2. And they should be supported with peer-reviewed sources. Okay, absolutely, under no circumstances, you cannot use dictionary definitions. All right, they're too general. The definitions need to come from the literature, and they need to be, this is how you're going to be defining the term for your study, right? So they should come from the literature, use a peer-reviewed source to anchor them, to support them. And sources should be recent when possible. That's just a good, it's just a good thing to keep in mind through the whole chapter and the whole dissertation, unless something is historic. And the definitions, it's not so important to have recent studies because sometimes things are from theories and theories are a little older. So that one's not so important here, but just moving forward with the thing in general, try to keep things as recent as possible. Again, unless something's historical or foundational. And I think that, yeah, and the form of, the form of the sentences for your definitions, just, they can be pat. They can be, really not mechanical, but you don't need to change it up. They can be as simple as, emotional intelligence refers to, or emotional intelligence is defined as, right? Pretty straightforward constructions for the sentences. All right, significant section. Professors like to call this the so what section. So you're conducting a study on emotional intelligence. That's great. So what? And by saying that, they're not being glib. They're kind of it's a way to get at how is your study important? The information you get, who's it going to be important to? Who can it inform? What can it tell us? How can it contribute to the literature? So that's what this section is about. And it usually has two prongs, contributions to research, or how your findings might be significant to research, and contributions to practice, or how your findings might inform practice, right? So for research and or theory, you have to think about, this is kind of forward looking. How might the information that you get from your study, how might it inform or contribute to the literature, right? What can it tell researchers that might help them, right? Maybe it gives us a new angle, on a theory, or, it gives us information that researchers can use. Maybe it might adjust how they look at things. We need to look at, something that you found important rather than something that was previously thought to be important. So you need to, answer those questions. How might your findings contribute to research? And the second prong is, and you can, break it out into paragraphs for, to make it organizationally friendly to your reader. How might your findings inform practice? In other words, people at the level of doing what it is you're studying. Say you're doing an education study on principles. Well, what can this information, how can it inform what principals do at the ground level, right? How can it inform administration, what administrators do? So that's what that means. How might your study get information that people can use in practice? Okay, and other sections I've kind of lumped together. Some schools have them, some schools don't. Some schools have a mixture of them. One is limitations. And these sections aren't long. They can be a little tricky because you're gonna be scratching your head thinking, what do I add here? And this is another good place to again look at approved dissertations for examples. But the limitations are of a study are potential weaknesses or shortcomings that can affect your results. So for example, a big potential limitation for quantitative studies is you may not get an adequate sample, like your sample size may be too low. And for quantitative studies that rely on statistics and numbers, that's a real problem because low sample size means that your statistical certainty of your information is compromised. That could be a potential limitation, especially if you have a subject that people might not naturally want to kind of gravitate toward. Right. Other limitations, qualitative studies, sometimes people are too close to the topic, right? So researcher bias can be a potential limitation. If you think that might be the case, you list it, and then you talk a little bit about ways to prevent researcher bias, right? And there are steps that you take to prevent or to mitigate researcher bias. So any kind of potential limitations you see on the horizon you want to discuss here. And there will be a time later in chapter 5 when you will discuss limitations that actually occurred, right? But for now, it's just you're kind of looking forward to think, what may throw a wrench in the gears, so to speak. Assumptions, these are things that you don't have control over, right? So you have to assume things so the study can move forward. And a big one is, and this is for qualitative and quantitative, is you don't have control over your researchers, right? You don't have control over what they say. So you have to assume that they're going to provide you with honest, straightforward, honest answers, responses. And a way to help ensure that is to, ensure them of the anonymity of their responses, ensure them that the material is confidential. That will help to increase their willingness to be honest. But it's one of these major assumptions that you just have to kind of assume it. You have to take for granted. Scope, sometimes called delimitation, sometimes they're different, but really they're the boundaries that you set on your study, right? You know, sometimes that's good. And I mean, say an education study where you're just going to study like parents, right? I know it's education, but let's just say, you know, the way parents work with their children on homework or something. So sometimes the delimitations, you know, you have to say, no, I'm not studying teachers, I'm not studying principals, I'm not studying students, I'm studying parents. This is a way to just kind of to highlight those boundaries of your study. And it's going to sound like a lot of the information that's in your purpose without the purpose statement, but, you know, here's your sample, here's your setting, here's what you're focusing on. You know, details like that about the sample, the participants, just again, to highlight, you know, where your study began, where it ends, you know, where the boundaries are. All right, and the summary, and just like any summary, you want to recap major points of the chapter, right? Remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed. Remember, the why is important because it's driving the whole study. And you can end, if you want, by transitioning to the next chapter. Okay. And here's our contact information. You know, just real quick, we do offer assistance with all the chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. With other aspects too, like IRB. When you get there, that's the internal review board that needs to review it once you've done with your proposal, the chapters 1 through 3. It's a form that needs to be filled out. We help with that. We help with PowerPoints. There's a proposal defense PowerPoint. There's a final dissertation defense PowerPoint. We help put those together. So there's different aspects of the journey that we help you with. And this is our contact information if you want to just find out more, to see what we offer and if that's right for you. And I'll leave that up, but I'll take questions now. If anybody wants to ask a question about the chapter 1, type it in the question and answer box or the chat box. No questions? Everybody's good with the chapter 1? All right, well, remember to check our website. We offer webinars on chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, and also other aspects of the study. So you may want to stop in for one of those to see what we offer on that. If I have no questions, then I'm going to let you go. Thank you for attending, everybody. Have a great day.